Growing up in a suburban family, I always thought my childhood was typical. I was the older sibling by 5 years, and when my sister was born, the attention in our home naturally shifted to her. I didn't mind at first. After all, she was just a baby. But as the years passed, her personality began to reveal itself. She was manipulative, demanding, and quick to throw a tantrum if things didn't go her way. Our father always insisted she needed more attention because she was younger, and our mother constantly urged me to be the good big brother. Over time, my sister internalized a belief that the world revolved around her. By the time I reached my teenage years, the cracks in our relationship had already begun to show. I took on a part-time job to cover my own expenses, while my sister avoided any form of responsibility. The chores that were meant for her would somehow become mine if she whined enough. I tried to keep the peace, swallowing my frustration, but it only fed her entitlement. Things escalated when she became pregnant a few years ago. The baby's father vanished, leaving her alone with no financial stability. My parents, ever doting, stepped in without hesitation. They gave her a place to stay, covered nearly all her expenses, and essentially raised my nephew for her. I helped out occasionally, watching my nephew when I could. At first, I didn't mind. I loved him. But soon, my sister began to take advantage. Babysitting requests turned into demands. What was supposed to be a quick 2-hour favor often stretched into an entire day. She never apologized, and if I dared to say no, she branded me as selfish. My parents would join in, pressuring me to support my sister. A few months ago, I reached my breaking point. I had an important all-day work training that I couldn't miss. That morning, my sister called, demanding that I watch my nephew because she had errands to run. I told her it wasn't possible. She erupted into a fury, calling me worthless. For the first time, I stood my ground. My schedule wasn't up for negotiation. She hung up, and I assumed that was the end of it. I couldn't have been more wrong. A few hours later, there was a knock at my door. To my shock, it was the police. My sister had called them, claiming that I had agreed to babysit, but then abandoned my nephew. I was stunned. I showed the officers my call logs, proving that I had explicitly refused. They quickly realized there was no evidence to support her accusation. However, because a child was involved, they had to report the situation to Child Protective Services, CPS, as part of protocol. I was furious and betrayed, but I figured the matter would be resolved once CPS saw through my sister's lies. What I didn't expect was for CPS to uncover something far worse. Their investigation led them to my sister's apartment, where they found a disaster. Dirty dishes piled high in the sink, half-eaten food scattered across tables, and trash strewn throughout the living space. My nephew's bedroom was in such a state of disarray that it posed a safety hazard. But the most alarming discovery was the bruises on his arms. When questioned, my sister brushed them off as minor playground injuries. Desperate to deflect blame, she concocted a wild story, claiming that I had orchestrated the CPS investigation to get revenge for the false police report. She even had the audacity to call and accuse me of ruining her life, insisting that none of this would have happened if I had just agreed to babysit that day. Her logic was as absurd as it was infuriating. As CPS continued their inquiry, they interviewed our parents and me. My parents tried to defend her, arguing that she was simply overwhelmed, but the social workers weren't convinced. They demanded concrete proof that my sister could provide a stable and safe environment for my nephew. The reality was undeniable. She had neither. My nephew spent more time at my parents' house than with her, and even then, there was no consistent, reliable childcare in place. Faced with the possibility of my nephew being placed into foster care, my father turned to me. He urged me to step up and babysit, so my sister could prove to CPS that she had a strong support system. He framed it as my duty to rescue my nephew from an uncertain fate. I love my nephew deeply, but the thought of once again enabling my sister's recklessness was unbearable. She had put me in this situation by lying to the police, and now I was expected to clean up the mess. I told my father that continuing to shield her from the consequences of her actions would only reinforce her self-destructive habits. For the first time, I refused to be manipulated. For years, my sister had lived in a world where she was never held accountable. From childhood, she had been coddled and indulged, her tantrums met with appeasement. Her responsibilities quietly shifted onto others. Our parents, in their desire to protect her, had unknowingly enabled the entitlement that would later spiral into something much more dangerous. When she became a mother, the cycle continued. My parents stepped in, providing a home, financial support, and more care for my nephew than she ever did. I played my part too, occasionally babysitting when I could, though I quickly noticed a disturbing pattern. What started as the occasional favor turned into an expectation. My sister would call me at the last minute, framing it as a small request, but in reality, she would vanish for hours. She never apologized, never showed gratitude, just assumed I would comply. And if I dared to say no, I was labeled selfish. That day, when she called demanding that I watch her son because she had errands, I finally refused. My work commitment was important, and for once, I put my own responsibilities first. She exploded, hurling insults before hanging up. I thought that was the end of it. Hours later, the police knocked on my door. My sister had reported that I had abandoned her child after agreeing to babysit. I was blindsided. I provided the officers with my call logs, showing that I had explicitly refused. They quickly saw there was no evidence to support her claim, but since a child was involved, they had to report the situation to Child Protective Services CPS. I was furious, betrayed, but I assumed once CPS realized she had lied, the issue would resolve itself. I had no idea CPS would uncover something far worse. When social workers visited my sister's home, they found a disaster. Dirty dishes stacked in the sink, half-eaten food scattered across tables, trash piling up. My nephew's bedroom was in such disarray that it posed a safety risk. More concerning were the unexplained bruises on his arms. My sister dismissed them as playground injuries, but CPS wasn't convinced. Realizing she was in trouble, my sister tried to twist the narrative. She falsely claimed that I had agreed to be her full-time babysitter, and that the state of her home was a result of her expecting me to manage the child more often. She framed herself as an overwhelmed mother unfairly scrutinized because her brother had abandoned his responsibilities. But I had proof: text messages, call logs, statements from family. When CPS formally interviewed me, I presented everything. I explained that while I had occasionally babysat, I had never committed to anything full-time, let alone on the days she called the police. I also shared concerning incidents, how she had once left my nephew alone in a locked car while she ran into a store for just a minute, which turned into much longer. I wasn't the only one who had witnessed her negligence. An aunt reached out, admitting she had once seen my sister leave my nephew unsupervised by a hotel pool during a family reunion, but had felt guilty for not reporting it. As CPS continued their investigation, my sister's behavior worsened. She threatened to defame me, to file more false police reports, and insisted it was my duty to rescue her from CPS scrutiny. But her outbursts only solidified what the authorities were already beginning to see. She had no intention of taking real responsibility. Tension in the family soared. My mother, desperate to keep the peace, proposed a family meeting, hoping that if we placated my sister, she would calm down and retain custody. I refused. I was done shielding her from the consequences of her own actions. At the meeting, my sister demanded that I publicly promise to support her custody claim. She wanted me to tell CPS that she was a capable mother and that I was fully committed to babysitting whenever needed. In other words, she wanted me to be her alibi. My mother pleaded with me, saying it was for my nephew's sake. My father echoed the sentiment, urging me to help keep the child out of foster care. But I refused to lie. Enabling her manipulations wouldn't fix anything. As we argued, My sister's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her face went pale. Then, in a fit of rage, she told us that the CPS worker had more evidence against her. Neighbors had reported seeing my nephew wandering outside alone. For the first time, my parents looked truly shaken. They finally realized this wasn't just a petty family dispute. It was a serious issue involving child endangerment. But my sister still refused to admit wrongdoing. Instead, she doubled down, insisting that we were all conspiring to make her look like an unfit mother. I repeated that I wouldn't lie to CPS to protect her. After that, my sister's anger turned on me completely. She took to social media, publicly accusing me of betraying her, of destroying our family, of trying to take her child away. Some relatives took her side, shaming me for making the situation worse by not helping. Others, however, finally admitted they had long suspected she wasn't capable of properly caring for my nephew. Meanwhile, the CPS investigation continued. They interviewed neighbors, gathered testimonies, and ultimately concluded that my sister was unfit for full custody. My nephew was placed under temporary guardianship with my parents until my sister could meet strict requirements: parenting classes, stable employment, a clean home. My sister's response? More rage. She filed a civil complaint against me, accusing me of slander, claiming I had told people she was an unfit mother. But my attorney friend reviewed the filing and assured me it was baseless. Truth is an absolute defense in defamation cases, and there was overwhelming evidence of her negligence. In response, we pointed to her false police report and considered filing for malicious prosecution. Realizing she was outmatched, she withdrew the complaint. By then, the damage was done. My nephew was already living with my parents, and my sister was left with only supervised visitation. She ranted about how the system was corrupt, blamed me for everything. But the truth was undeniable. If she had never lied to the police, none of this would have escalated the way it did. Legally, I felt vindicated. The false police report was on record. While the district attorney didn't pursue criminal charges, the documentation ensured that her credibility was permanently damaged in the eyes of CPS. I kept all my receipts, call logs, texts, just in case she tried something again. For once, she backed down. My nephew is thriving under my parents' care. He finally has stability, a routine, a safe home. Even my parents, who initially pressured me to help my sister, have come to see the severity of her issues. They still love her, but they can no longer excuse her recklessness. As for me, I maintain a close relationship with my nephew, visiting regularly, giving him the stability his mother never could. The heartbreak is that his own mother is missing from his daily life. Not because of some conspiracy against her, but because of her own choices. Every now and then, my sister tries to stir up new drama, still complaining on social media about how her family stole her child. But few believe her anymore. The neighbors' testimonies, the CPS findings, and her own erratic behavior are well known. The truth is out. Looking back, refusing to babysit that day seems like such a small thing. But in reality, it was the catalyst for a much-needed reckoning. It forced everything into the open. Her neglect, her entitlement, her willingness to lie to the authorities just to shift blame. My father once said, maybe you could have just watched him that one day. But I believe we would have ended up here eventually, no matter what. This entire ordeal forced my sister to confront consequences she had spent her entire life avoiding. If she genuinely changes and proves she can be a responsible parent, I will support that, for my nephew's sake. But I will never lie for her, never enable her again. In the end, standing my ground exposed the truth. And perhaps in its own way, that is the best kind of justice.